What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 15 of the Black Massacre series, where today I will be discussing the Springfield Massacre of 1908. The Springfield Massacre of 1908 consisted of events of mass racial violence committed against African Americans by a mob of about 5,000 white Americans and European immigrants in Springfield, Illinois. Between August 14th and 16th, 1908, two black men had been arrested as suspects in a rape, and attempted rape and murder. The alleged victims were two young white women and the father of one of them. When a mob seeking to lynch the men discovered the sheriff had transferred them out of the city, the whites furiously spread out to attack black neighborhoods, murdered black citizens on the streets, and destroyed black businesses and homes. The state militia was called out to quell the rioting. The riot, trials, and aftermath are said to be one of the most well-documented examples of the complex intersection of race, class, and criminal justice in the United States. In 2008, an NPR report on the centenary of the race riot said that the fact of its taking place in the northern state, specifically the land of Lincoln, demonstrated that black people were mistreated across the country, not just in the South, and described the event as a proxy for the story of race in America. At least 16 people died as a result of the riot, 9 black residents and 7 white residents who were associated with the mob, 5 of whom were killed by black residents and 2 committed suicide. It was misreported for decades that only militia were responsible for white deaths and that more whites than black people had died. Personal and property damages suffered overwhelmingly by black people amounted to more than $150,000, approximately $4 million in 2018, as dozens of black homes and businesses were destroyed, as well as 3 white-owned businesses of suspected black sympathizers. As a result of the rioting, numerous black people left Springfield, but it is unclear how many moved away permanently. Although in the following months over 100 riot-related indictments were issued and some pled to minor violations, only one alleged rioter went to trial and conviction for lesser offenses. Of the 2 accused black men who were the initial focus of the lynch mob, one was eventually tried, convicted, and hanged. The other was set free. Near the 100th anniversary in 2008, the city of Springfield erected historical markers and a memorial statue. The riot was a catalyst for the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, organized to work on civil rights for African Americans. In 1908, Springfield was a transportation hub, connected by railroad to other major cities such as Indianapolis, Louisville, and Kansas City, and etc. Illinois is often considered a microcosm of the U.S. and Springfield, with about 45,000 people at the time, most of whom were working class, was described as an average American city. In July 1908, the U.S. was pulling itself out of the Panic of 1907, which occurred during a lengthy economic contraction between May 1907 and June 1908. This contraction led to suspension of cash payments by banks, a halt in lending, and a fall in the stock market, all in resulting in significant economic disruption. Industrial production dropped, and the period saw the second highest volume of bankruptcies to that date, with the dollar volume increasing nearly 50%. Production fell over 10%, commodity prices dropped by more than 20%, imports fell by over 25%, and unemployment, which had been less than 3% prior to the panic, increased to 8%, resulting in fierce job competition. As of April 1908, there were 200,000 unemployed men in Illinois, with 55% of those residing outside of Chicago. Comparatively, neighboring Iowa and Missouri, which had populations that were 40% and 60% of Illinois, which equaled out to 5.5 million, had 2,000 and 43,000 unemployed men respectively. Prior to the panic, over 1 million immigrants had arrived in the U.S. during each of the previous 2 years. However, after the panic, the rate of arrival began declining by nearly 40%. Due to its dependence on mines, railroad, and vice industries such as saloons, Springfield was largely insulated from much of the contraction. However, the city still could not escape the economic downturn of the region, including new alcohol policies passed in 1908 that would suddenly put the employees at nearly 2,000 bars across the state out of work, including 20% of the saloons across Sangamon County. There was growing unrest among railroad workers after the Illinois Central Railroad began a retrenchment cost-cutting policy in December 1907. For example, men in nearby Clinton saw their work week drop from 7 to 4 days a week by March 1908. That same month, the railroad also began streamlining positions to further cut expenses, which caused many to be bumped down to lower jobs, affecting younger workers. There was also uncertainty amongst Springfield miners at the local and national level. In November 1907, 4,000 miners in Danville went on strike when coal operators stopped paying workers in cash and began issuing checks. 5 months later, on April 1st, 1908, Springfield's miners were nearly part of the 250,000 miners across the country who went on strike after their contracts expired and coal operators showed no inclination to make new contracts with the union. Illinois' 60,000 miners subsequently declared war against coal operators. The unrest led to the shutdown of Illinois mines for a month, which had a significant negative impact on the freight business for the railroads as coal cars sat idle during that time. The lack of coal movement also impacted road workers who could not pave the roads without the coal. In early May, while over 35,000 Illinois miners voted to return to work, miners in 2 districts voted to move forward in the strike, Peoria and Springfield. Around the same time, miners in neighboring Decatur voted to go on strike, and on June 8, 1908, roughly 500 miners called off 2 separate strikes at the Pawnee and Panna mines over work conditions. Ultimately, these events created a Springfield workforce where workers by and large had jobs, but the earning power of those jobs was being diminished. The security of those jobs was laced in uncertainty, and the respect paid to those who held those jobs was seemingly being diminished. In surrounding counties, the job prospects were similar or worse, and the workforce was less diverse. As Reconstruction came to an end between 1870 and 1890, the United States was undergoing a massive population increase. Between 1890 and 1908, rapid industrialization and urbanization brought millions of European immigrants to the country. Arrivals usually came to Ellis Island, then trekked to cities where relatives had already been establishing themselves, expanding ethnic communities throughout the country. Springfield, a rapidly growing industrial center, was one of those cities. At the turn of the century, Springfield's population was about 35,000 people and growing. In 1900, the immigrant population, which prior to 1890 had only grown at a rate of 0.15% per year and remained stagnant at roughly 4,500, began to grow at a rate of 4% per year, a 300,000% increase. According to the United States Census Bureau, in 1908, nearly 35% of these immigrants were unable to speak English and nearly 15% were illiterate. This created tension between white immigrants and white Americans, who feared their growing political presence. White Americans were increasingly more negative, fearful, and xenophobic toward the immigrants, who they deemed to be biologically inferior, culturally and religiously odd, and generally substandard, with a proclivity to filth, laziness, and violence. Within the country's racial hierarchy, European immigrants were perched below whites, but above black people, fending off degrading ethnic slurs such as honky, which was for Hungarians, Guinea for Italians, and Polak for Polish. Alien in thought, grotesque in manner of life, the thrifty and laborious Pole is a conspicuous figure, slow to learn even simple English, unable to express in our tongue any abstract ideas. Only one can conjecture his inner life and mental attitude. His part in the drama of conflicting races has thus a silent, pantomimic effect that came from the New England magazine in 1904. Such attitudes presented new immigrants with a choice: fight to become socially white or align with politically and economically disadvantaged black people. In an atmosphere where immigrants heard statements like "one white man is as good as 2 or 3 Italians," and where whites were bringing lawsuits against their own family members who they suspected of having quote-unquote tainted black blood. Immigrants opted to strive to become white. In a country where the distinction between white man and black is intended as a distinction of value as well as ethnography, it is no compliment to the Italian to deny him his whiteness. That was a statement from Robert F. Forster, who was an economist, in 1919. America is not a melting pot. It is a sizzling cauldron for the ethnic American who feels that he has been politically courted and legally extorted by both government and private enterprise. The ethnic American also feels unappreciated for the contribution he makes to society. He resents the way the working class is looked down upon. Unfortunately, because of old prejudices and new fears, anger is generated against other minority groups rather than those who have power. That was a statement from Barbara Mikulski, who was a former senator, and she made the quote in the statement in 1970. As white races proliferated alongside the sciences and ideology that imparted legitimacy to their existence, color and race became detached in the case of whiteness. Instead, white came to be populated by a hierarchy of peoples, at the top of which was America's charter white race, the Anglo-Saxons, and a number of rank order lesser white races. We sometimes lose sight of the lengths of which white Americans, especially of the working and lower classes, went to patrol the boundaries of white. However, it was always understood, and that was a statement from David A. Gerber, an historian, in 1999. The pressure to become white led to many immigrants seeking ways to prove their whiteness. Protecting and expanding the notion of white supremacy was deemed convincing evidence. At the time, black people were expected to be subservient, agreeable, and deferential to whites, or be subject to verbal abuse, threats, or physical violence. Whites who viewed black people as being uppity would often impose quick and harsh retribution against them. As immigrants observed how white Americans treated black people, they began not only mimicking such treatment, but also distancing themselves from black people geographically and socially. For example, in the particularly distressed economy of 1908, many European immigrants opted for unemployment over taking jobs that perpetuated stereotypes of them, or taking quote-unquote nigger jobs that would associate them with black people. In Springfield, such attitudes were inflamed by white Americans who had immigrated from Kentucky across the Ohio River, from the border area of southern Illinois, and also from other areas across the South, seeking work in the mines and railroads. These southern immigrants brought the heightened racial animus with them that was associated with the segregated racial culture of the region. Following the Civil War, black people began migrating north not for work, and also in search of areas less socially oppressive than the South. In the post-Reconstruction years of the late 19th century, Springfield, as a rapidly growing industrial center, was one of those places black people sought refuge and prosperity, with the city's black population growing by 4% per year. By the turn of the century, there were nearly 2,500 black people in the city, representing about 7% of the population, which was about 35,000. The same level of growth had not been true for Springfield's European immigrant population in this period. The annual growth rate of the immigrant population was 0.15%, not growing beyond roughly 4,500 people. But after the turn of the century, immigrant settlement in Springfield increased rapidly. Around 1890, the migration of black people to Springfield began to slow. In the early 20th century, black people from the rural South began the Great Migration, and many began moving to larger cities such as New York and Chicago. Between 1900 and 1908, the annual black migration rate in Springfield decreased from 4% to 3%. Meanwhile, for European immigrants, the trend was the reverse. By July 1908, Springfield's population was over 45,000, of which about 40% were under the age of 21. Of those 45,000, nearly 6,500 were European immigrants, who together with the first generation American offspring accounted for 40% of Springfield's population, while native white Americans made up just about 55% and black people about 6%. These population shifts had economic, political, and social implications, particularly as the unemployment rate increased from under 3% to 8% between May 1907 and June 1908 during the panic. In 1908, there were slightly more than 1,000 black men in Springfield's workforce. About 50% were porters and laborers. Only 150 were employed as miners. Most of the rest were restricted to lower class and unskilled jobs. For example, there were no white janitors in the city. but some worked for the city as firemen and policemen. Black people generally lived in the racially segregated neighborhoods of the Levee and the Badlands. Realtors used restrictive covenants that prevented black people from purchasing property elsewhere. Social tensions rose due to the swelling immigrant population, the decrease in job stability, and the movement of a few upper middle class black people into white neighborhoods. Resentment among white immigrants ran high against black people. Whites resented upward mobility among black people as a threat to a social order in which they should always be superior, and white business owners often exploited this resentment for their own economic benefit. For example, some industries use black workers as strike breakers during labor strikes, pitting black people and immigrants against each other in an effort to prevent unionization. Black workers' contribution was of another order, that of keeping the workers divided and adding conflict to a situation in which it was already rife. Further, by this move, the Packers profited on two accounts. First, they tapped into an almost inexhaustible supply of cheap labor. Second, they secured thereby a labor force offering even greater resistance to unionization through racial antagonism than supplied the immigrant through language, handicap, and nationality hatreds. Stories of black strikebreakers were carried by numerous newspapers in Illinois. The disproportionate coverage of these instances fueled by white antagonism against the black workers. In 1898, labor violence broke out in what was called a Battle of Verdun, resulting in 11 deaths. Springfield immigrants were anxious about competing with the city's black minority, and the city's native whites worried about growing political power among the city's black people. Black people had no allies among the whites and were caught between the suspicions of native-born and immigrants. Prior to the Civil War, there had been some degree of tolerance for sexual relationships between black men and white women. However, after the war, keeping the races separate became essential in maintaining the racial hierarchy of white supremacy, because black men gained suffrage after the war, granting them political power to be social and economic competitors with white men. During Reconstruction, black male sexuality became a battle cry of Southern politicians decrying Negro domination, warning of the perils of racial equality. The idea of manhood was synonymous with the rights and responsibilities of U.S. citizenship. Whites began framing black manhood with sexual connotations, conflating the political and economic agency of black men with sexual agency framed as aggressive and transgressive, from which whites, particularly white women, needed to be protected. Politics and black manhood became increasingly intertwined, even being debated on the floor of the United States Congress. In the lead up to the passage of the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1872, whites who testified before Congress exhibited extreme anxiety about sexual relations between black men and white women, with testimony linking to fears of black men's political and economic independence. Rape of white women, it was argued, was the natural proclivity of black men without slavery to restrain them. Free black men were commonly equated to unchained animals or black brutes who lacked human intelligence and could therefore not be entrusted with the right to vote. Conversely, black women who were routinely raped by white men, resulting in a population of over 1 million mulattoes, were deemed as lacking sexual morals, casting the entire race as void of morality and intelligence, so that they should not be allowed to vote. Frederick Douglass noted the political link of black men being accused of rape. It is only since the Negro has become a citizen and a voter that this charge has been made. This charge was made to blast and ruin the Negro's character as a man and as a citizen. Vigilantism and lynching were deemed necessary evils to protect whites politically, socially, and economically from the lawlessness of black people. During such attacks, black men were ritually castrated as an act of further emasculation, making them examples of the fate of black men who dared to step out of their place. Simply being accused of any offense against whites, regardless of evidence or the motives of the accuser, will result in the conviction or lynching of black people. White women, as social and economic beneficiaries of a white-dominant racial hierarchy, were not only purveyors of this treatment of black people, but in many cases actively sought such treatment against black people. Such notions commenced an era of terrorism and lynching of black men. In the 43 years from the end of the Civil War until the attacks in Springfield, instances of labeling black men as some variation of brute, menace, beast, nigger, rapist, fiend, or otherwise inferior had been printed in newspapers across the country over 200,000 times, approximately 13 instances per day. In the 12 months before the events in Springfield, such labeling appeared in newspapers across Illinois over 500 times, more than once per day. The frequency of black men being labeled in such negative terms accentuated the perception among whites of their very presence as a threat, a perception in which blackness, vice, and crime were conflated. In 1907, the year before the attacks in Springfield, this perceived threat was addressed on the floor of the U.S. Senate when Senator Ben Tillman delivered a rousing speech advocating the economic and political protection of white men from black men by nullifying the 14th Amendment and the social protection of white women from black men by means of lynching. I never have called them baboons. I believe they are men, but some of them are so near akin to the monkey that scientists are yet looking for the missing link. We saw the evil of giving the ballots to creatures of this kind and saying that one vote shall count regardless of the man behind the vote and whether that vote would kill mine. As far as lynching for rape is concerned, the word is misnomer. When stern and sad-faced white men put to death a creature in human form who has deflowered a white woman, there is the feeling of participating as mourner at a funeral. They have avenged the greatest wrong, the blackest crime in all the category of crimes, and they have done it, not so much as an act of retribution in behalf of the victim as a duty, as a warning as to what any man may expect who shall repeat the offense. They are looking to the protection of their own loved ones. The white women of the South are in the state of siege. Some lurking demon has watched for the opportunity to seize her. She is choked or beaten into insensibility and ravished, her body prostituted, her purity destroyed, her chastity taken away from her, and a memory branded on her brain with a red-hot iron to haunt her night and day as long as she lives. Is it any wonder that the whole countryside rises as one man and with set, stern faces seek the brute who has wrought this infamy? Brute, did I say? Why, Mr. President, this crime is a slander on the brutes. No beast of the field forces his female. He waits invitation. It has been left for something in the shape of a man to do this terrible thing. And shall such a creature, because he has the semblance of a man, appeal to the law? Shall men cold-bloodedly stand up and demand for him the right to have a fair trial and be punished in the regular court of justice? So far as I'm concerned, he has put himself outside the pale of the law, human and divine. I have 3 daughters, but so help me God, I had rather find either one of them killed by a tiger or a bear and gather up her bones and bury them, conscious that she had died in the purity of her maidenhood, than have her crawl to me and tell me the horror story that she had been robbed of the jewel of her womanhood by a black fiend. The wild beast would only obey the instinct of nature, and we would hunt him down and kill him just as soon as possible. What shall we do with the man who has outbrewed the brute and committed an act which is more cruel than death? Try him? Drag the victim into court, for she alone can furnish legal evidence, and make her testify to the fearful ordeal through which she has passed undergoing a second crucifixion? Our rule is to make the woman witness, prosecutor, judge, and jury. I am satisfied to get out of the world such creatures. In the period after the end of Reconstruction, approximately 1897 to 1917, lynchings coincided with mass disenfranchisement efforts throughout the country. During this time, wealthy white men sought to keep political power from black people, and poor white men sought to keep economic power from black people, while European immigrants sought to obtain political and economic power for themselves. Such views of black people led some within the black community, particularly light-skinned black people, to try to escape the associations of being black in white society. Many consciously or unconsciously accepted a white-dominated racial hierarchy and a bias against other black people. This meant that black people were not only victims of anti-black racism, but in some instances also perpetrators of it. Black people who held such bias maintained that assimilating with whites could bolster their appeals for equal treatment. Therefore, they geographically and socially removed themselves from other black people, trying to gain the social acceptance of whites, supposing that if black people were more respectable, well-behaved, more well-to-do, and so on, they would incur less resentment and racism. However, this strategy for obtaining equal treatment usually backfired, as such black people found themselves ostracized by both whites who labeled them uppity and black people who labeled them Uncle Toms. They received marginally better treatment from whites in exchange for helping to keep other black people in their place, and also for being tokens whose limited presence allowed whites to mute accusations of racism thrown against them. Such black people were often in positions of authority and stature, including police officers, businessmen, and politicians. However, when whites felt threatened that they might have to compete politically or economically with black men, such as elections or during periods of unemployment, wage instability, or high crime, such as what occurred in the Springfield region throughout 1907 to 1908. During the mine strikes and panic of 1907, white men became increasingly hostile towards black people, especially those who wielded positions of stature and authority. We have but little interest in the value of slaves, but there is one matter in this connection about which we feel a deep interest. We are opposed to Negro equality. To prevent this, we are willing to spare the last man down to the point where women and children begin to suffer for food and clothing. When these begin to suffer and die, rather than see them equalized with an inferior race, we will die with them. Everything, even life itself, stands pledged to the cause. And that quote came from Mountaineer David W. Seiler, and it was a letter to Governor Zebulon Vance about poor whites in Appalachia fighting for the Confederacy, dated November 3rd, 1862. 1908 was an election year in Springfield. The city had been plagued with rampant political corruption for 20 years when Indiana's Blocks of 5 voting system was introduced to the community, enabling a vice ring to dominate local affairs. White politicians looking to secure votes began buying votes from black men in exchange for legal immunity, allowing vice in the black saloon district to thrive. The politicians also brought in votes in the white saloon districts, but negative labeling of black men had framed their corruption as being more harmful, more dangerous, and more lawless than the same corruption from whites, despite black people owning less than 3% of the city's saloons. Any offense committed by black people was deemed the fault of black corruption, black saloons, black suffrage, and black upward mobility. In Springfield, much like across the country, problems arose when black people were not kept in their place. It was noted that the Negro of Springfield is not the Negro of the South, and that a black man in Springfield had an aggressive attitude, which he would use to readily argue that he was just as good as a white man. Corrupt white politicians were said to have contributed to this arrogant attitude by giving them city jobs despite the majority being lazy, dishonest, vicious, worthless, and genuinely bad. It was reportedly that this attitude that created a strong dislike amongst Springfield's white citizens, on par with the dislike of black people in the South. Much of Springfield's atmosphere at the time was a result of its relationship with Prohibition. Prohibition represented a conflict between urban and rural values emerging in the United States. With the rising population of immigrants in urban centers, more immigrants began frequenting saloons. This spawned the notion that saloons were breeding grounds for moral and political corruption due to the perception that immigrants traded their votes for favors such as jobs, housing, food, etc. In a backlash to the changing demographics, many prohibitionists embraced nativism, fostering further resentment toward immigrants who typically, due to cultural differences about drinking, were against prohibition. After a highly contentious debate on prohibition in 1907, the Illinois General Assembly approved the local option law, which allowed local residents to decide whether their towns would be wet, or allowing liquor sales within the boundaries of individual counties and townships, or to otherwise be dry. In April 1908, after a Sangamon County vote, only 2 of the county's 27 townships opted to be wet: New Berlin, which was the home of the 4 saloons, and Capital Township, which included Springfield and accounted for over 80% of the county's nearly 250 saloons. At the time of the vote, approximately $2.2 million, or over $55 million in 2018, was spent on alcohol in Springfield's more than 200 saloons, 6 of which were black-owned, generating tax revenue that accounted for 1/3 of the city's $300,000, about $7.5 million in 2018 annual budget. While there were nearly 18,000 all-male ballots cast in the county vote, the overall sentiment of the county becoming dry was favored by just 2 fewer votes than those who favored it in remaining wet. This caused the Springfield Mayor Roy Reese, a politician known to curry political favors through vice, to implement a minimal regulation to keep voters on either side of the issue happy by prohibiting any saloon to operate between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. Despite this, Springfield remained a hotbed for drinking, as the saloon serviced both local residents and also became a destination for visitors. Many including many of whom were unemployed or underemployed from neighboring dry townships and counties. For example, between May to June 1907, neighboring Decatur had nearly 70 arrests for drunkenness. However, 1 year later, after Decatur became dry, it had 80% fewer drinking arrests, and every man who had been arrested for drunkenness had obtained his liquor in Springfield. The drinking culture in Springfield fed into the pending attacks in 2 days. First, though Springfield was somewhat sheltered from the sluggish economy, the panic did leave more men unemployed or underemployed. Second, many of these men would frequent the saloons where they would drink daily, binge drink, and abuse alcohol due to mental strain, financial pressure, shame, and a feeling of helplessness that were unable to protect and provide for their families. Socially, unemployed white men felt aggrieved against black men who either had jobs or owned property and otherwise lived well. Drunkenness arrests were particularly high on the 4th of July, a fact that would later play in the ensuing attacks. For example, in 1907 in Decatur, there were over 200 arrests for drunkenness on the 4th of July. The holiday resulted in so many issues that the Inner Ocean newspaper of Chicago published an annual list of injured, arrests, and fires resulting from celebration of 4th of July. In 1907, there were over 70 recorded injuries and nearly 20 arrests on the list. On Saturday, July 5th, 1908, at approximately 12:45 a.m., shortly after the saloons closed for the night, an intruder allegedly entered the home of a 45-year-old white hoistering engineer at a mine named Clergy Posey Ballard, located at 1135 North 9th Street. Ballard was a longtime resident and one of the best beloved men of the North End, a primarily white mixed-income neighborhood. He had worked on the Chicago, Peoria, and St. Louis Railroad for 16 years, has been employed at the Jones and Allen mine for the last 2 years, and was well liked among the mining community. That evening, Ballard's 16-year-old daughter Blanche spent the 4th of July celebrating at the White City Amusement Park along the eastern suburbs of Springfield with some friends and neighbors. The event had attracted 5,000 people during the day, and the night attendance was more than double that number. Blanche returned home shortly after midnight. Blanche alleged to have just fallen asleep, though it would also be reported that she awoke from a heavy sleep in her east-facing front bedroom when she was awakened by the presence of a strange form lying at the foot of her bed, a bed that she also shared with her 10-year-old sister Marie. Blanche alleged that she stretched her hand out and touched the form in her bed, with her thinking it was her 22-year-old brother Charles arriving home after her and seeking repose in her bed rather than his own. She asked, "Is that you, Charlie?" When she received no answer, she asked if it was Charles again, then grabbed the form's hand and felt hard substances in it. Allegedly frightened, she recoiled and the form jumped away, mumbled something, and ran into the parlor on the north side of the house, where he proceeded to go from room to room. Blanche allegedly called out to her 43-year-old mother Gertrude, who went by her middle name Emma, which was said to have awakened her father. Ballard went to Blanche's room and, perceiving a Negro in the house, tried to approach the man. However, before Ballard could close in on the man fled. Ballard had seen nothing but a fleeting glimpse of the intruder, who reportedly ran back to the girl's bedroom and out the front door, going around the south side of the house toward the rear. In his undergarments and not knowing exactly which way the intruder had gone, Ballard reportedly went outside to his front porch. It would later be reported he exited to his back porch, where he allegedly encountered a Negro who was coming around the house. As the men neared the rear of the home, Ballard was then reportedly attacked without hesitation by the assailant with either a knife or a razor. Ballard reportedly fought with the attacker around the house, up onto the porch, out into his yard, and crossed the yards of his neighbors for a distance of fully 100 feet. It was unknown how the fight transpired, but Ballard was reported to cut to ribbons with a sharp weapon presumed to have been a razor. They kept fighting until they got to the fourth house from our house. Then the man let go of my father and ran away. And that was a quote from Blanche Ballard. Exactly what happened in the yard, no one knows save Ballard and the Negro. And that was a quote from the Illinois State Journal. 11 different wounds were found on the body of the murdered man. The one which appeared to be fatal was in the chest, and it looked like a knife thrusting. It punctured the lung below, and leading from it to the left was a long curved slash which was not very deep. Across both arms, just below the elbows, were deep cuts severing muscles to bones. A slash across 6 inches long extended across the neck. There was a gash across the top of the head, one across the neck, one in the front, and one behind the right ear, and a number of smaller cuts on the face, chest, and arms. And that's a quote from the Illinois State Register. After he was cut, Ballard allegedly staggered back to the porch. Reportedly, Emma had been a terror-stricken witness from the porch and did not realize the severity of Ballard's wounds until he, weak from loss of blood, fell to the ground. Ballard would be labeled a hero who undoubtedly prevented an outrage or rape against his daughter. The commotion failed to catch the attention of Ballard's fireman sons, Charles and 24-year-old Homer, who were also in the unlocked house until Emma and Blanche allegedly called out to them. Homer and Charles ran outside, reportedly in their undergarments, and gave chase to the intruder, who had allegedly crossed the street and turned north towards the watch factory. Rather than continue to chase the assailant, Charles and Homer retreated back home, reportedly to help their father. As they were helping Ballard off of the ground, Ballard allegedly raised his head and pointed to a man standing in the space between the two houses on the east side of the 9th Street. Ballard reportedly told his sons, "There's the Negro now, for God's sakes get him, boys, for he's killed me." Charles and Homer left their father again, and the two young athletes chased the man who ran northward. Some of Ballard's neighbors who had been alerted by Emma's calls reportedly joined the pursuit. The assailant, who had allegedly entered the Ballard home through the unlocked front door, reportedly outran those chasing him, with his speed noted as being fleet of foot. Though some newspapers report that the assailant outran the posse because he had too much of a head start. The assailant reportedly ran north on 9th Street. Homer Ballard would later state that he chased the assailant north on Grand Street and disappeared onto the grounds of the Illinois Watch Factory. However, other reports claim that the assailant was seen crashing into a tree on the watch factory premises, but staggered and continued on until he disappeared among factory park trees. Ballard's family then brought him inside their home and tried to help him, but could not stanch the gust of blood. Ballard could not talk much as he had lost a lot of blood. Police Chief Wilbur F. Morris was awakened at 2 a.m. and alerted. He placed every officer in town on alert, assigning patrols along the east and northeast sections of the city. The police took Ballard to Springfield Hospital. Around 20 minutes later, close to 1 a.m., a 30-year-old mulatto, Ed Jamison, was robbed and stabbed near his residence on Reynolds and 9th Streets, about 6 blocks south of the Ballard home. The only thing the robber reportedly took from Jamison was his coat. Jamison was severely stabbed in the right shoulder, over the collarbone, and across his left breast, splitting down his right arm from his shoulder to his wrist. He was taken to St. John's Hospital, where he was interviewed about his attacker. He claimed that he was walking along Reynolds Street, having just crossed 9th, when he was suddenly attacked by a black man that rapidly approached him, grabbed him by the coat, and demanded to Jamison, "Give me your coat." When Jamison refused and tried to step away, the attacker allegedly began slashing him with some sharp instrument. Jamison reportedly fell, and his attacker, whom he described as light-colored Negro with a slight mustache, ran away. Jamison sustained one cut along his head, another across his back, and still another down his left forearm. He ran home, where he fainted, and was then taken to St. John's Hospital, where he was interviewed by police about the attack. The police believe Jamison knew his attacker but refused to name him. It was never confirmed whether Jamison knew his attacker. Early July 5th, after the police learned of Jamison's attack, they made a strenuous effort to find Jamison's attacker, believing that he might be the same Negro that cut Ballard. However, the following day, July 6th, the police dismissed Jamison's attack, stating that it had positively no connection with Ballard's attack, concluding that Jamison was stabbed with a razor or long-bladed knife, and maintaining that Ballard was stabbed with a penknife. The next morning, only 2 newspapers reported on the events that took place at the Ballard home: the Illinois State Register and the Illinois State Journal. Both local Springfield newspapers. They both ran descriptions of the assailant, however, accounts differed. The Illinois State Register described the assailant as being about 5 feet 8 inches tall, wearing a blue shirt and light-colored trousers. The newspaper reported that the police found a light-colored hat, and that the hat was the only clue to the assailant's identity. The Illinois State Journal, on the other hand, described the assailant as being not very dark in color, medium-sized, and dressed in rough garments. The newspaper also reported that a piece of overall material, though it later will be reported as a piece of shirting that Ballard has in the grasp of his hand after the struggle, was found in Ballard's yard, which his son Homer would later claim to be the assailants. Ballard's son Homer also gave a description of the assailant. He says, the Negro was dressed in light trousers, wore a new pair of shoes, a blue shirt, brown winter cap, and a black coat. He was a yellow Negro. Neighbors of the Ballards reportedly saw a Negro walking up and down in front of the Ballards' residence during the early evening on the 4th of July. Around 5:30 a.m. on Sunday, July 5th, 4 young white women, Clara Knoll, Sadie Van Dyke, and Anna and Henrietta Ford, coming from a wake, discovered Joe James sleeping off a hangover in the North End, about a half-mile away from the Ballard home. Some reports say he was found in the grass in Reservoir Park. Others reported he was found in the weeds of a vacant lot, a half-block north of the park, and others reported he was found in the rear of a watch factory on the west side of Reservoir Park. While 2 of the girls watched James, the other 2 went to a park phone and called in the vicinity of the Ballard home, asking for men to come there to investigate. When the news reached Ballard's 2 sons, Charles and Homer, along with 2 neighbors, Pledge Sears and Joseph Edwards, who claimed that James had also invaded his home before allegedly invading the Ballards, went to the area where James was sleeping. The men allegedly found James with blood on his clothes, his shoes not on his feet, and a coat thrown over his head. They woke him and, armed with a piece of a 2x4 scantling, beat the black wretch while a crowd gathered around to watch. The Ballard brothers Sears and Edwards dragged and beat James for half a block while the crowd chanted "kill." It was reported that only the arrival of officers prevented the mob from killing James. James was reportedly not lucid during the beating and made no effort to resist or defend himself, even as he was dragged for half a block toward a nearby telephone with the intent of lynching him. 3 deputies who noticed the gathering crowd as it began chanting "kill" then stepped in, stopped the men from beating James, and arrested James. He was booked into the jail at 6:20 a.m. 5 hours later, around 11:45 a.m., Clergy Ballard succumbed to his wound and died. The day after the attack, Emma Ballard gave the following statement: "The girls, my daughter, were sleeping in the dining room, and my husband and myself in an adjoining room with double folding doors between. I was awakened by my daughter Blanche calling and awakened my husband, telling him that someone was in the house. He arose and went into the room where the girls were sleeping, but the burglar heard him approach and escape through the front door, which was open when my husband went to look for the man. Mr. Ballard then went to the front door, then out onto the porch. The man, who was a Negro, came around the side of the house and my husband attempted to catch him. The Negro jerked loose and attacked my husband with a knife. I was standing in the door at the time but could do nothing. My husband struggled with the Negro, but the Negro had the advantage and cut him 4 or 5 places, severely cutting him in the neck, on both arms, and in the chest. The Negro broke loose and ran, leaving my husband badly bleeding on the porch with his night clothes nearly torn off." Several days after the attack, Blanche Ballard provided the following statement to authorities: "It was 12:30 o'clock when I came in. It must have been about 10 minutes till 1 o'clock a.m. when I got up to move a bird in a cage from the window. Then I went back to bed, but did not go sound to sleep. I woke up suddenly and grabbed a hold of a man's hand. I thought he was my brother, and I said to him, 'Is that you, Charlie?' He made a growing noise. Then I asked him again if he was Charlie and asked him why he did not go to bed and what he was doing. When I said that, I still had hold of his hand and tried to pull something out of it, something rough. Then the second I grabbed it, he sprang to the right side of the bed, and he was there in no time and jumped right over the foot of the bed and stood at the foot of the bed. Then he went into from through a door that was leading from my bedroom and stood in the doorway leading to the front porch. Then when he heard us talking, he came back in again and tried to hide behind the door. Then he came back into the dining room where he met Mama. By that time, he heard Papa, and Papa asked him what was he doing there. Then he ran back through the front room door onto the porch. Papa said, 'I wonder where he went too quickly.' With that, they heard the squeaking of shoes around the south side of the house, which caused Father to go to the end of the porch and see what it was. As Papa got to the end of the porch, the man stabbed him, and Papa went back to the door and hollered to my mother to give him something to hit the Negro with. The man followed up to the porch and stabbed Papa again there on the porch. They began to fight while there, and they kept fighting until they got to the fourth house from our house. Joe James was a young man from Birmingham, Alabama. He had two brothers, Benjamin and Daniel, and two sisters, Lizzie and Bertha. His father died when he was 2. He was then raised by his uncle, Reverend Van B. James, and had a boyhood but little different from that of the typical Negro youth. His uncle raised him in the church in Avondale, where he learned to read, write, and play piano until he was 13 years old. He then went to live with his mother, Catherine, back in Birmingham until she moved to Hattiesburg, Mississippi for work. In 1903, she briefly returned and married Walter Roberts, but left to Hattiesburg in 1904, taking James with her. In May 1907, James moved back to Birmingham, where he worked in a brush factory as a bristle puller and drove a coal wagon before opting to leave. Over about 4 months, James moved to several places, including Memphis, Kansas City, East St. Louis, and Alton, doing a series of odd jobs before coming to Springfield. He arrived on June 1st, 1908, by hitching a ride on a freight train going from St. Louis to Chicago. James wandered around Springfield attempting to obtain work in a brickyard or as a molder. However, no such work was available, and he found work at one of the 6 black saloons, presumably Bud Brandon's saloon on 6th Street. He worked there that evening, where he played a game of pool with some Negroes who became sore on him because he won. He worked past closing and into the morning of June 2nd. It was reported that at the point of the day, James got into an altercation at Bud Brandon's saloon on East Washington Street, though this altercation was not verified. When James left work, he encountered William Burton and James Loomis, 2 of the city's 4 black police officers. Burton and Loomis were in plain clothes when they saw James walking, and assuming he was loitering, ordering him to leave town. Rather, James offended the officers when he reportedly told them, "A nigger has as much right to be here as a white man. A white man is no better than a nigger." James told the officers that he had a job, but could not recall the name of the saloon, so they did not believe him. When they threatened to arrest him, James told them he would leave. However, James did not. The next day, Burton and Loomis found him on the streets and arrested him for vagrancy. On June 3rd, he was fined $25, which is about $650 in 2018, which he had no means to pay. Therefore, he was given a jail sentence. His release was set for July 7th. James, who had been arrested once in Birmingham for trespassing but never convicted of any crime, was reportedly a model prisoner permitted to leave and run jailhouse errands as a trustee. However, on July 4th, about 6 p.m., after completing his prison duty for the day, loading a lot of condemned dogs, James was given about 40 cents or $10 in 2018, and allowed to go get molasses, bread, and pie for the other prisoners. The police claimed that James left the jail barefooted, and James did not return. It was Independence Day, and most of the retail establishments closed at noon. People were celebrating, drinking early, and preparing to see fireworks in the evening. James, a teen who had not been exposed to this level of excitement in Alabama, was enticed to the atmosphere. He wandered into the levee, the city's black vice district on Washington Street between 7th and 10th Streets, which was filled with an assortment of 6 saloons, prostitutes, gambling, opiates, etc. The area, along with its adjoining black areas such as the Badlands, was disdained by many whites, which they called a den of sin, but also for the normacy at which black people and whites intermingle socially and sexually. The Black Belt in Springfield, one of the most vicious districts in the North, the houses of this Black Belt are hovels. Whites and black people lived together. Children ran through the street of this miserable settlement who know not their parents. Their hair indicates one race and their fair skin the other. And there are white resorts where the lowest form of depravity exists. After purchasing the food for the prisoners, James went to Lee's Saloon on Washington Street between 8th and 9th, where he purchased 2 beers. From that point and for 6 hours, James drank and gambled primarily at Dandy's Gym Saloon, where he played the piano all night while patrons bought him drinks and where he drank himself into insensibility. He was awakened the next morning around 6 a.m. near Reservoir Park, where Lanford High School now sits, where a group of young white men led by Charles and Homer Ballard grabbed him and proceeded to beat him until he bled profusely from his nose and ears. I don't remember. The last thing I recollect, someone gave me a nickel when I was shooting craps, and I don't know whether I shot it or spent it or put it in my pocket. I don't remember anything that happened after that until someone spoke to me when I woke up in the morning. And that was a quote from Joe James from the Illinois State Register, September 17, 1908. James' face was so badly beaten that he was rendered incapable of speech and did not look much like a human being. The police declined to wait until the swelling around his mouth had gone down before sweating him, noting that the interior of his head still seemed to be very badly muddled as the result of the beating. Police Chief Morris expressed confidence that he would get a confession from James, who, as best he could at that point, expressed ignorance about the entire affair, but was notably very much frightened about the murder charge against him. The arresting officer, J.T. Hedrick, added that James had nothing in his pockets when he was arrested. Upon James' arrest, the Illinois State Register described him as being 21 or 22 years old, about 5 feet 6 inches in height, and weighing about 140 pounds. However, 2 months later, during his trial, the same paper would describe him as being heavily built. The newspaper went on to call him a copper-hued mulatto, arrested wearing a black coat, blue denim shirt, light trousers, and new patent leather shoes. His cap found at Ballard's home was said to be a winter hat made of brown wool. Conversely, the Illinois State Journal described James as a typical Southern darky of medium size and of color, not real dark. James was said to be positively identified by Sheriff Deputy Harry Taylor, who identified the cap and the piece of torn shirt as belonging to James. He was also identified by Bob Oakley, a 38-year-old mulatto, and said to have been a former police officer who was now a bartender at one of the black saloons. Oakley voluntarily called into the police station when he heard about what happened. Oakley stated that he had seen a strange Negro, possibly James, ordered out of Bill Johnson's saloon on East Washington Street the night before. Oakley was shown the cap and piece of shirt allegedly found in Ballard's home, at once furnished a correct description of the little Negro, James. Oakley added that the strange Negro was now wearing new shoes. 3 weeks later, Oakley's nephew Lee Oakley, who lived with Oakley the year prior, was arrested for stabbing someone during an altercation with a knife. Lee was a shoe shiner at a saloon near 6th and Monroe Streets. James was also said to have been positively identified by those who had chased him, by every member of the Ballard family who had an opportunity of catching a glimpse of the murderer, and by the bloody penknife that Officer Jack Golden, accompanied by Ballard's sons, found after James' arrest. The penknife was reported located 3 feet from where James was sleeping on the grass. The penknife was also reportedly stained with blood, had a blade that was fewer than 2 inches long. The police verified that James had no weapon on him when he left the prison on the afternoon of July 4th. It was reported that James had been kicked out of Johnson's saloon for mooching money for liquor, with the same report stating how he, as in James, got back in on 9th Street is unknown. James was immediately labeled the murderer. However, newspapers questioned the logic of the reported event and admitted finding his motives to be difficult to understand. Robbery had been ruled out because nothing in the house was molested, and Ballard's modest home is not one to attract a burglar. But with the alleged intrusion occurring in the bedroom of Ballard's daughters, and with James being black while the girls were white, it was surmised that James must have been attempting to rape the girls, and newspapers began defining him in sexualized terms such as a brute of the lowest form. One conclusion that finds most supporters is that James was a degenerate Negro inflamed by strong opiates with a crazed brain that sought satisfaction only in human blood, and that is a quote from the Decatur Herald on July 6, 1908. Prior to James' arrest, the police thought the assailant who had robbed the victim of a coat the night before was probably the same Negro who cut Ballard. Though the victim's description of the assailant did not match the description of James, James became the only suspect after Ballard's son Homer claimed to have found materials of the assailant at their home. No mention of the other stabbing would be reported in newspapers again. On July 15th, James was taken before the special grand jury, the first special grand jury that Sangamon County ever had. The grand jury was composed of 23 men. They discussed James' case all morning, with county and state officials stating they were prepared to convict James beyond a shadow of a doubt. James' attorneys entered a guilty plea, a strategy to avoid the death penalty that they believed would result in life imprisonment instead. However, it was reported a life sentence would not be well received in Sangamon County, as feelings run high against the Negro amongst whites who wanted him hanged. The police department noted that if it were up to them, they would have hanged James right away. However, it was determined that the civil docket is so full that it will be impossible to have the case against James docketed before August 4th. James made no comment about his predicament, only referring reporters back to his initial statements. Stubborn to the last ditch and refusing to say a word that will either better or aggravate his defense, the Negro wards off all queries propounded on him. Not only does he grumble his evasive answers to those who seek to pinion him down to the facts of the tragedy, but he never entered the conversation with any of the employees at the jail and takes all of his meals without saying a word to anyone. The police and sheriff's force have been baffled and they have decided not to question him further. On August 14th, the Illinois State Journal reported that a respectable young married woman had been attacked in the same working class neighborhood as clergy Ballard's, the North End. Mabel V. Hallam, the 21-year-old white wife of well-known streetcar conductor William Earl Hallam, claimed that on the night of August 12th at her home at 1153 5th Street shortly before midnight, a black man cut the screen door to the back door of her home, threatened to kill her, then dragged her naked from the bed out into her garden, where he raped her and beat her unconscious. She alleged that after the violent assault, she leapt over a back fence and sought help from her mother-in-law. I was lying in my bed in the front room with the rear door open, having the screen door latched, and was awaiting return of my husband, who was employed on the car lines. It was just 11:20 o'clock when that Negro came into our home and came directly to my bed. He laid on the bed and grabbed a hold of me. This of course awakened me. My husband does not possess such habits, and I asked him the question, "Why, Earl, what is wrong with you?" To which the Negro replied, "I am drunk." Then he commenced gagging me, telling me all the time that if I made any outcry, he would kill me. I was so frightened I could not think of any move to make, although I did manage to make a couple of light screams, one of which was heard by Mrs. Hallam, my mother-in-law, residing next door to us, and whose bedroom is only a few feet from mine. The fellow dragged me into the backyard, carrying and pulling me through the kitchen of our home. He pulled and jerked and yanked at me until we were in one of the outbuildings. All of the time his fingers were buried in my neck and the pain was intense. Finally he released me. Going out through the front yard, I climbed the fence into the yard of my mother-in-law and there met her coming to me. It was then 11:45 o'clock, just 20 minutes after he pounced upon me in my room. Police Chief Morris was awakened in the middle of the night with the news. He assigned the entire police force to the case. George Richardson was a 36-year-old black lifetime resident of Springfield. He was from a prominent black family in Springfield. His grandfather had been Abraham Lincoln's barber, and white newspapers cited him having above the ordinary intelligence. At the time, he was a hod carrier working on a home with other black builders on North 5th Street near Hallam's home. The police assigned to look for Hallam's attacker the night before saw the men working and surmised that the perpetrator was probably among the group. The police took the men, changed their clothes, and one by one delivered them to Hallam's home, where she pointed out Richardson as her attacker. Mrs. Mabel Hallam suffered from the nervous shock today, but was otherwise unhurt from her terrible experience. She was able to put up with the ordeal of facing strange Negroes during the day and inspecting a number, none of whom she recognized, save Richardson. Richardson professed his innocence, maintaining that he was at home all night with his wife Maud at 1305 East Capitol Avenue. His wife, who was said to have an excellent reputation among her acquaintances regardless of color, validated Richardson's alibi and was committed to testifying in his defense. As God is my judge, I am innocent of the crime I am charged with at Springfield. I have tried to conduct myself so as to win respect of my white neighbors and believe that I have done so. I was born in Springfield, educated in public schools there, and have always lived there. I am 36 years of age, have a wife but no children. My wife believes in me and we are proud of our little home. I have worked for Mr. Reinhardt, contractor, for some time, and also work when I can find work to do. I worked all day Thursday and went home at 6 o'clock awfully tired. I ate my supper, sat on the porch, and smoked until 8 or half past 8 o'clock and went to bed. I never left my room that night but went to work Friday morning as usual. I was arrested while at work and was much surprised to be taken for this crime. I believe that my neighbors will support my alibi and vouch for my good character. I never saw Mrs. Howland before until she identified me as the man who assaulted her. She is mistaken. I am ready to go back whenever the authorities think safe to do so and stand trial." And that was a quote from George Richardson on August 15th, 1908. However, the police claimed that his coat was torn and that they found a trace of blood on his coat that was in line with Hallam's statement that she tore her assailant's coat. Richardson also remained a suspect because it was erroneously reported that he served time in St. Charles prison for being involved in a fight, resulting in someone's death, and that he had only been out of jail for the last 2 years. However, after the incident was investigated, it turned out that he had a clean record, had never had any issue with the law, and unlike many black people in Springfield, was a property owner. Despite multiple eyewitnesses account placing Richardson on his porch with his wife at the time of the attack, police arrested Richardson and took him to the county jail, where Hallam hesitantly picked him out of a lineup of potential suspects. She cautioned that she could not be certain if Richardson was her alleged attacker because all colored men looked alike to her, telling Richardson, "I believe that you are the man and you will have to prove that you are not." Richardson was charged with rape and put in a cell with Joe James. Hallam had even produced a witness, 17-year-old William Roller Keyes, to testify against Richardson. Keyes lived at 1149 North 5th Street at the time, which was homes away from Hallam's home at 1153 North 5th Street. While in jail, it was reported that people in Springfield speculated that Hallam's husband, unable to cope with her allegedly being raped by a black man, would leave her. False rumors also began to circulate that Hallam had positively identified Richardson and that he had confessed to committing the crime. It was reported that because 3 other young women lived nearby, that the black man was waiting to catch the first one of the 3 that stepped outside. After he was arrested, Richardson's brothers were also persecuted. His younger brother Tom, a produce clerk, was chased out of town when he was attacked in a wagon that he drove for a packing firm in the street. He escaped, left his wagon behind, jumped on a train at Illinois Central Station, and fled to Mississippi. Richardson's older brothers, James and Williams, were arrested and thrown in jail for public safety. Conversely, Mabel Hallam had contracted to have her likeness sold by a postcard vendor for money while her husband was appointed a special deputy sheriff to their neighborhood. Early in the afternoon of August 14th, once Mabel Hallam positively identified her attacker, a crowd of about 3,000 white men gathered in downtown Springfield looking to lynch James and Richardson. The crowd, numbering about 5,000, went to the Sangamon County Jail, surrounded the scaffolding that was built there for Joe James, and demanded the prisoners to be given to them so they could lynch the niggers. Around 4:30 p.m., the commander of the 3rd Division of the Illinois National Guard, Colonel Richings J. Shand, was alerted to the conditions around the jail by Captain H. Tuttle, an assistant surgeon with the 4th Infantry. Shand claimed to have alerted Governor Charles Deneen, who directed him to consult with the sheriff of the area, Sheriff Charles Werner. When Shand arrived to the jail, Werner allegedly told Shand that he did not consider the situation serious at all and that troops were not necessary. Shand stated that he told Werner that given Werner was responsible for keeping the peace in the area, if he rejected Deneen's offer to troops and a riot broke out, that Werner alone would be responsible. Werner then requested 1 precautionary company, Troop D of the 1st Cavalry, be placed at the State Arsenal building. Shand convinced Werner to place 2 additional companies there, Troop D Company C of the 5th Infantry and the 4 men of the Gatling gun platoon of the same company. Werner ordered 5th and Gatling platoon to remain at the Arsenal building and for the 1st to assemble at 8 p.m. Shand, however, argued that 8 p.m. would be too late, as miles would get unwieldy at night. He pressed Werner for a 7 p.m. assembly, but Werner refused. Werner believed he had the situation under control as he prearranged for firemen to respond to an orchestrated false fire alarm at 5:08 p.m. While people were distracted watching the firemen, Werner enlisted 49-year-old Harry T. Loper, a wealthy restaurateur, a commissary of the 2nd Brigade of the Illinois National Guard, and owner of one of the few automobiles in Springfield, to drive James and Richardson to McLean County Jail, about 65 miles away in Bloomington, for their safety. Loper was escorted by Sheriff Deputies Kramer, Hannaran, and Rhodes, and Sergeant of Police Fred Yenzel. Once they reached Bloomington, James and Richardson were put on the train to Peoria, as Warner feared the mob might go to Bloomington and try to retrieve them. After the crowd learned that Loper had arranged the suspect's transfer, the trickery upset them more. Warner ordered the crowd to disperse, however many went to go watch a 5-cent picture show while others, still angry, walked the streets and went to saloons to go drink. Soon after Loper returned from Bloomington, around 8 p.m., he was confronted with a mob armed with brick bats, clubs, and revolvers, and showed up to Loper's restaurant for revenge. The mob was led by Kate Howard, a 42-year-old white divorcee who had a reputation for being loose with the boys. Howard, whose ex-husband was highly respected and owned a wallpaper store on 8th and Adams, had lived in Springfield nearly 20 years, where she ran the Howard Hotel, a boarding house rumored to be one of the city's roughly 30 white brothels, with her brother William E. Connor at 115th Ave North 5th Street. Howard shouted to the mob to destroy Loper's property. "What is the matter with you fellows? Are you afraid to go in?" Loper, who had served black people at his establishment, was prepared to defend his property. He fired a warning shot with his shotgun over the crowd when they began throwing bricks into his restaurant. But as the crowd descended upon the premises, Loper retreated further into the building, where he would escape through a hole in the brick wall. The crowd tore through the restaurant, raiding and hurling his liquor. At this point, only 26 militiamen of the 1st and 5th had assembled. Shan sent them to the jail and armed with bayonets, instructed them to clear the mob of over 3,000. As the men tried to do so, Shan received a call from Governor Deneen that there was trouble at Loper's. Shan ordered the men at the arsenal to go over to Loper's to assist with the 1st and 5th, but Warner refused, telling Shan that he did not want to leave the jail for the mob. Warner allowed only 10 militiamen to go to Loper's and forbade them to fire upon the crowd. At Loper's, the mob destroyed the restaurant's interior, tossing the tables and chairs onto the street, while at least 4 uniformed police officers watched. They then distributed the cigarettes and silverware amongst themselves as souvenirs. William F. Lee, a looter at Loper's restaurant, laughed as he recalled, "I seen old Barney Lang, one of the dry good merchants or clothing merchants, out on the street picking bricks out of the street and throwing them through Loper's restaurant. And of course, I went down into Loper's, and between I and another guy I was raised with and went to school with, Horny Barberry, I ran into him at Loper's, and Horny Barberry and I went down and knocked the cash register over and got the change out of it. Outside, the mob overturned Loper's car and lit the gas tank, destroying it. They threw the tables and chairs into the fire, making a bonfire with flames that reached as high as the 3rd floor of the building. The mob danced around the bonfire in frenzied delight and fiendish glee. Mayor Roy Reese arrived at the scene and begged the mob to disperse, but they threatened to throw him into the fire too. The mob held the mayor hostage for 2 hours before friends of his were able to extract him and bring him to safety. When a wagon load of police finally arrived, the mob dragged them from the wagon, confiscated their clubs, and tore their insignia from their uniforms. Firemen also arrived, but the mob cut their fire hoses with razors. By the time the 10 militiamen arrived, to a crowd now outnumbering 5,000, they found no disposition on the part of civil authorities to assist them. However, the militiamen conceded that they were helpless because prior to leaving the state arsenal to come to Loper's, they only procured 1 box of rifles there, but found no ammunition in the building. In addition, Governor Deneen forbade the militia from using their Gatling gun, and for reasons never explained, the ammunition wagon that was assigned to come to them never came. The few soldiers who were armed were overrun and their weapons were confiscated by the mob. Once the crowd dispersed, a white 19-year-old rubbernegger, Louis Johnston, was found dead in the basement with a shot in the neck. He was the first casualty of the events. Loper managed to escape the crowd, taking his family to Michigan for safety, where he would learn that the quote-unquote riot had voided out any insurance claim he might have sought. Loper would later say of his decision to help the sheriff, "I have been through one riot in Cincinnati in '83, the greatest in this country, when 100 men were killed. It was to avoid loss of life that I took those men out of town. I did not favor the man. I had no interest in him. Whatever and would go just as far to punish him as anybody. But after going through the Cincinnati riot and knowing the sheriff as I do, I know he would be killed first before he would let the jail be taken. I thought I would save lives by removing the colored man." Around this time, Governor Deneen called for an increase of militiamen, realizing local authorities were overwhelmed. Around 10 p.m., the crowd moved to Washington Street chanting, "Curse the day that Lincoln freed the niggers, no niggers in Springfield, and kill them on sight." They went on to the Lyric Picture Show, also owned by Loper, on Spring and Edwards, and destroyed it. They also reportedly attempted to burn down the former home of Abraham Lincoln, but were thwarted by a relative of Lincoln's, Ninian Edwards, who was at the property and was a custodian of the home. The mob bypassed the white-owned Payne's gun store, which owned most of the guns and ammunition in the city, and instead went to Fishman's Pawn Shop at 719 East Washington, which was owned by Reuben Fishman, a Jewish man. A member of the mob claimed Fishman was selling guns to black people, so they went to his shop and demanded guns and ammunition from him. When he refused, they called him a nigger lover, ransacked his shop, taking every gun in it, and set the shop on fire. The mob also overtook a cavalry squadron, Troop B of Taylorsville, usurping their weapons and making the cavalrymen flee for their lives. By 11 p.m., the sound of gunshots was constant. Sheriff Warner did not allow police to confront the mob along Washington Street, and while Shan made the call for the 50 additional troops to 9th and Madison, Warner forbade them from going toward the heavy violence, telling Shan it was injudicious to leave the jail unguarded. When Shan replied that he could leave the 5th to guard the jail, Warner refused, telling Shan that he wanted to wait for reinforcements. However, reinforcements would not arrive for another 4 hours at around 2:20 a.m. During that time, the mob began attacking black businesses with hatchets and axes, wreaking vengeance upon the Negro population without mercy. Proclaiming that they were going to clean up and fix the streets so a white woman can walk along here without being annoyed, they tore through black barbershops, car shops, and bicycle shops and churches, hurling things through windows, looting property, and establishments buildings down. There were bricks piled all along the street. They then went to the black saloon, starting with Dandy's Gems, where Joe James had played the piano before being accused of murder. As the mob tore into the building, Dandy Jim, whose real name was James Smith, tried to protect his business and several black women who lived above his saloon by firing at the crowd through his second-floor window. However, it was clear his effort was of no use. He fled the premises through a back alley, ran and hid in a feed yard as the mob ripped out the front of his building and demolished the interior. The mob went through all 6 black saloons, confiscating and drinking the alcohol before vandalizing the premises. They also went to hotels such as the Siles Hotel, the Leland, and the St. Nicholas, looking for black guests. They dragged out those they found and beat them in the streets. White women and young white girls were also participants in the mob and in the beatings. It was reported that the attacks seemed to have been planned, as they simultaneously occurred in 6 areas. The mob destroyed a total of 35 other black-owned businesses, shattering windows and storefronts and looting property all along Washington Street, terrorizing black people. Beating black people with their own furniture was included. The mob particularly targeted the homes and businesses of uppity black people, such as political insiders, men of wealth, men in relationships with white women, etc., and any whites known to be in relationships with or thought to be sympathetic to black people. Republican businessman C.C. Lee saw all of his businesses, a saloon, pool hall, barbershop, restaurant, movie theater, the Star, demolished. Democratic influencer William Johnson also lost his saloon. However, any black person was a target for harm. Black people sought shelter wherever they could find it. For example, the mob chased a black man to a political speech where Prohibition Party candidate Eugene W. Chafin was speaking. The black man ran onto the stage with Chafin in fear. Chafin protected him, telling the mob on stage, "I will shoot the first white man who attempts to take this colored man." However, as he made that proclamation, someone in the mob hurled a brick bat at his head, knocking him down, which started a melee between the mob and Chafin's supporters. Houses and businesses owned by whites were spared damage so long as white clothing was hung from their windows to signal that the home was white occupied. Once seen the place was owned or inhabited by whites, the mob would shout things like, "Leave it alone, there's no niggers there," or "That's a white man's place, pass it up." However, the mob and the crowd of onlookers, totaling near 10,000, prevented the fire department from making runs to the burning homes of black people. Despite such things, when 30-year-old William H. Bowe, the high society chief clerk of the country treasurer's office, who had come from a nearby town in order to participate in the attack, was allegedly shot by a gang of Negro thugs as he was allegedly on his way home through the Badlands at 3 a.m. near the spot where Burton was lynched 30 minutes prior. Bowles' shooting would later be described as murderous assault and reported as a sign of the feelings with which black people regarded all whites. The Badlands was the poorest neighborhood in Springfield. It was a 4-square block area that extended from the levee and was bound by East Jefferson on the south, East Reynolds of the north, and the 9th Street east to Springfield city limits. While most of the area's inhabitants were poor, several upper middle class black people also resided there. However, due to its proximity to the levee, the area was vulnerable to pockets of vice. It was described by the press as an area infested with Negroes living in huts and rife with crime. Practically all of the Black Belt was disreputable. The houses were hovels, mere makeshifts for coverings. Around 1 a.m., Kate Howard led the torch-carrying mob down Madison Street and into the Badlands, pointing out which black homes and businesses to destroy to a mob now vowing to kill every nigger in town. As they made their way to the first black home, where 2 black men and a woman sought refuge, a police officer made his way through the mob and stood in front of the home. He proclaimed, "Give me these niggers and you can burn down the entire row of houses." The mob torched its way through the Badlands, totally destroying the area, where a few men would enter a shack and, after tipping over the bed and tearing open the mattress, would pour on a little oil and apply a match. That was all there was to it. They left then feeling sure the fire would not be interfered with, and it wasn't. The mob would not permit even a stream of water to save any of the black homes, though, like in the levee, permitted aid to white ones. You can have any white people's now houses near here, but the nigger houses have got to go. Some mob members also forced black people to burn to death in their homes. There was a lot of colored people burned up in that riot. There was colored people run out and set the houses on fire. Anybody ran out and they knock him in the head, pick him up and throw him back in the house. And that is a quote from William F. Lee, Loper's Restaurant looter. At 2:30 a.m. Saturday morning, Shan and some troops accompanied Sheriff Warner to 12th and Madison Streets, where Warner asked the crowd to disperse 3 times but was ignored and jeered. Shan advised allowing the troops to take a volley of shots, low and below the knees of the crowd. However, Warner refused and ordered the troops to shoot a volley over heads of the mob, but agreed to allow Shan to immediately fire low if the high volley did not work. When the troops laid the high volley, it only further enraged the mob, which still did not disperse. Shan prepared the troops to immediately fire low, but Warner reneged on his agreement on the low fire, protested, and began giving contradictory orders to Shan's troops. With the noise and confusion, this resulted in some of the troops firing high, while others fired low, injuring and killing several mob participants, which dispersed the crowd. After the mob had cleared, the troops cut down the body of a black man, Scott Burton, who had been lynched nearby. The troops of the 1st then addressed the mob at Mason Street, west of 12th, and had begun driving the mob back. The captain sent for assistance to Sheriff Warner and Shan, pleading that he could not disperse the crowd unless given the authority to fire into it. However, again, Shan refused. The troops, being unable to control the mob, could do nothing but report back to the main body and practically leave this crowd in possession of Mason Street of 12th, west of 12th, leaving the area of the Badlands under the rule of the mob. At no time during the riot did the actual command pass from the sheriff to the military authorities, and that is a quote from Commander Shand. The following morning, the city was littered with bodies of drunken mob members who had passed out in the streets. Shortly after 12 p.m. Sunday morning, Deneen ordered additional militia. By early Monday morning, there were nearly 3,700 officers and militiamen in the city. Throughout the day, rumors would be reported about black people retaliating. The troops would send a squad to investigate, and the squad would find no truth to the rumors, i.e. that a black man was trying to set fire to a home north of Grand Avenue. Though the rumors were found to be untrue, getting the troops to break into small squads and search home by home served the segment the militia. In some activities, the militia joined in mob activities. For example, a black family, the Mitchells, raised their own meat, smoked their own ham, and procured watermelons that they would sell to neighbors. The Mitchells had a large ice box that they used to store this food. Militiamen entered the Mitchell home and raised the icebox of all his food. Also, at least one militiaman was arrested for disorderly conduct. Such acts and the lack of use of force to help protect them made many black people distrustful of the militia. The crowd moved on toward the Badlands, the heart of the black residential area, burning down homes. The mob destroyed a 4-block area, caused much damage to neighboring streets. When firefighters arrived, the mob impeded their progress by slashing their hoses. Many black people fled town, found refuge with sympathetic whites, or hid in the state arsenal where the white militia protected them. The militia finally dispersed the crowd late that night after reinforcements arrived at 2 a.m. Scott Burton, a 65-year-old black man, had a small barbershop located at 12th and Madison that catered exclusively to white clientele. Around 2:30 a.m., Burton had been at home with his wife, Kate, when the mob, offering bounties of $25 for a nigger, approached his home and threatened them. Burton allegedly fired a warning shot out over the crowd, further enraging them. Moments later, the mob rushed into his home. Father was sitting in the house with us when the mob came around the corner. Some of them came into the house, several of them struck him with bottles, and one man had an axe which he hit him with. The men then took him out of the house, and that is the last we saw, and that was a quote from his daughter. The mob beat Burton, who was falsely identified in some reports as Charles Hunter, until his head was a bloody, lacerated mass of flesh. While he was unconscious, they then tied a rope around his neck and dragged him 1 block south to Madison and 12th Street to a tree near his barbershop as men and women spat on him. The mob, including Mabel Hallam's husband, William, sought to lynch Burton, with one of the mob participants calling out, "Get the rope." However, the mob did not have any rope on hand. Someone grabbed a nearby clothesline, wrapped it around Burton's neck. They then stripped off his clothes and pulled the clothesline up over the tree and hanged him. After he was dead, the mob mutilated his body, riddling it with 30 bullets, slashing it with knives, and attempting to set it on fire. Children played with Burton's body, swinging it back and forth on the tree, while the mob shouted, "We've got one, hurrah, look at that nigger swing." Then they danced around it. The mob then burned down Burton's barbershop. As it burned, mob members raced to ensure the fire didn't spread to the adjoining white businesses. Burton would later be blamed for his own death by Governor Deneen, who suggested that Burton incensed the mob when he fired a warning shot trying to protect his family and property. The next evening, August 15th, around 7 p.m., more militiamen arrived to maintain order. Curiosity seekers and tourists who heard of the attacks also arrived in the city. A new mob of about 1,000 whites formed and approached the state arsenal, seeking to arm about 300 black residents who had taken refuge there. When confronted by a militiaman, the crowd splintered off and changed direction, with about 200 of them heading to southwest Springfield, an area where few black people lived. One of the black people who did live there was William K.H. Donegan. Kentucky-born Donegan was an 80-year-old black man and former friend of Abraham Lincoln and General John M. Palmer. He had resided in Springfield about 60 years, was a cobbler, prominent in real estate, and well-respected. It is rumored that he became wealthy by importing slave labor into Springfield before the Civil War. After the war, he served as a middleman to whites in Springfield who sought to contract with newly free labor. Though he would be criticized for procuring a system for these new black people which greatly resembled slavery, Donegan was responsible for bringing many of Springfield's initial black residents to the city. Because of this, some whites blamed him for the black population existing in Springfield. Known as Uncle Bill, Donegan was the most well-known black man in Springfield. He was reportedly worth about $15,000, which is about under $400,000 in 2018. And also owned his home, as well as other properties that housed some of his family members. While Donegan had broken no laws, he was an influential black man who had also been married to Sarah Rudolph, a 52-year-old Irish-German woman, for over 30 years. He was said to have also angered all his white neighborhood as he refused to sell his property and moved. Around 9 p.m., the mob arrived at Donegan's home, with many in the mob later admitting that they targeted him because he was married to a white woman. Donegan family called the jail and the militia headquarters for help long before the mob arrived. We had been warned that a mob was coming, and we telephoned to the jail and asked for soldiers. We telephoned several times, and though we were promised each time that the soldiers would come, they did not. We were afraid to stay but didn't know where to go, so had to wait there. When the men came to the door and they asked, "Are there any niggers there?" William said, "No, only white people." "You're a liar," a man hollered, and that was a quote from his sister. The mob started making threats to burn his home down, and the 6 of the mob members ran inside firing their guns. Donegan's family fled out the back of his home, but he suffered from severe rheumatism and was nearly blind, so he could not go with them. Instead, he fled under a bed, but the mob found him, hit him in the face, and dragged him outside, where people threw bricks and stones at him. Donegan pleaded with them to have mercy on him, noting that he hadn't done anything to them, and at one point saying, "Even I worked on some of your shoes." The mob ignored his pleas and senselessly beat him. As he staggered around after the beating, his throat was slashed with a razor. His throat was rumored to have been cut by a 10-year-old boy. However, Abraham Raymer, a very short non-naturalized immigrant who was childlike in appearance, was later suspected of being the culprit. After his throat was cut, someone yelled, "Drown him in the River Trow," while others screamed, "Lynch him." Donegan was dragged over to a low tree across the street from his home in front of the Edwards schoolyard, 2 blocks away from the governor's office. One of the mob members grabbed the nearby clothesline, which was then looped around his neck 4 times and once around his face and mouth before it was tied around the tree, from which he was then hanged. However, because the tree was short, his feet were only partially suspended off of the ground. Once Donegan was hanged, some of the mob went back to his house and attempted to set his home on fire. However, militiamen arrived to the scene and the perpetrators ran away. The militia found Donegan still alive. His awkward position kept him alive until the police came. They found him with his neck severed, breathing through the holes in his windpipe. When they cut him down, they could not remove a piece of the clothesline from his mouth, as it had gotten locked in his jaw, which had become firmly set. Donegan, who never regained consciousness, had the 8-inch gas across his neck sewn up by Captain H.H. Tuttle. The mob had also broken skin in several places which the militia physician attended. He was eventually taken to St. John's Hospital, where he died the next morning. 2 days after he was lynched, Donegan's niece, who fled to Chicago after he was lynched, would say this of his murder: "They say my uncle was killed because he's married to a white woman, but they have been married 20 years, have children, and own considerable property, and the property was the cause of his murder. He was even told by some of the ringleaders of the mob that he had too much property for a nigger." And that was from Carrie Hamilton, August 17th, 1908. Following the attacks, 10,000 tourists traveled to Springfield to see the aftermath. With the roughly 3,700 militiamen in town and many black people returning to the city, a food shortage ensued. Business was largely halted for 10 days. News of the attack spread across the country. There is a bitter irony in the fact that the largest force of state troops ever assembled in Illinois were summoned by the governor of Lincoln State to protect the Negroes whom Lincoln emancipated from citizens of Lincoln City. It is a sorry comment upon American civilization that no better use has been made of our resources of law, education, and religion than to have allowed that population to have become, in large part, so depraved that the new race of white barbarians trust no means of protecting themselves from them except the blood and fire of extermination. The isolation to which the increasing racial antipathy consigns the Negro populations in the cities of the Northeast and West, as well as the South, may have confidently be reckoned upon to produce everywhere all the elements for just the crucifixion of its justice, humanity, and religion as the nation has suffered in Springfield. And that was a quote from Graham Taylor, Charities in the Commons, 1908. Over 100 whites were documented as being injured while participating in the attacks. It is unknown how many black people were injured, as many fled, and also due to white city officials and most newspapers opted not to record the injuries of black people who stayed or returned. For example, in the initial injury list of 62, included 3 black people and omitted others such as Charles Duncan, an elderly black man stricken with rheumatoid arthritis who was shot in the chest by the mob when he tried to flee his home as they surrounded it. Duncan would later sue the city for his injury. Several black people were also pulled from streetcars and places of business where they worked and frequented, such as the Silas Hotel and Dreamland Theater, and beaten in the street. At least one black man is on record of having a nervous breakdown when police arrested him and sought to have him committed to a mental hospital after finding him taking lumber from the lumber yards, stating his determination to rebuild all of the burned homes in the East End. 7 people were on record as being dead, 2 black men and 5 whites. However, there were several more unreported deaths, such as Lewis Hainan, a white man who was struck in his chest and groin and chin, along with John Caldwell, by a volley laid down by the militia near 12th and Madison. Hainan did not succumb to his injuries until November. In addition to Scott Burton and William Donegan, there were also 6 unidentified black people killed, 4 from bullet wounds from 11th and Macon Street, 1 with his throat cut near Chicago and Alton Streets, and 1 found hanging from a tree on 15 and Clay Streets with his clothes slashed to shreds and his body riddled with bullets. Such black deaths were corroborated when the families of 4 of the black men who were killed sought to bring lawsuits against the city for their deaths but were denied the right to file. All 5 of the white men who were killed, Lewis Johnston, who was shot by the mob, Earl Nelson, who was stabbed by a militia bayonet, James W. Scott, killed by a ricochet bullet, John Caldwell, shot by the militia, Lewis Hainan, shot by the militia, died at the hands of other white mob members or by the hands of white state militia. In addition, at least 1 black infant died from exposure after her family was made refugees and no neighboring community would allow them in. Some black deaths were unaccounted for because their loved ones buried them at night out of fear whites might attack them, while the loved ones of other black people transported the bodies of their dead off to the countryside for burial. It was also said that several black people were burned alive in their homes, and that at one point black people had to send out of town for more caskets as they had run out. Early after he was shot, William H. Bowe was erroneously reported as being killed by black people. However, he did not die and continued to live in Springfield until he died 50 years later in 1958. Many black people fled Springfield during the attacks. They had to escape on foot and hid in cornfields, sometimes getting onto trains or pleading for refuge with nearby rural families. Maddie Hale recalled her family took people in. We sheltered, I guess, above 20 or 25. We had a large barn, and a lot of them went up there and stayed all night in the barn loft. Some slept out underneath our fruit trees, and we taken some in the house, and we fed them. We went to the garden and gathered vegetables and cooked. Those who returned to Springfield faced increased hostility. For example, when a group of newly homeless and destitute black women returned with their children at 12:15 p.m. near Passfield and Cedar Streets, the white residents sounded the fire alarm. When the firemen came, the white residents stated they were looking for protection as they were frightened by the presence of the women and children. Many black people returning had no personal effects except what they managed to carry with them. The next morning, the prairies, was just full of niggers. Some of them would have a sheet wrapped around them or a blanket, or some of them wouldn't have a damn thing on. They wouldn't have a stitch on. They were coming back into town. They had gotten out of town, waiting away from the riot. Got out in the sticks and hid in the sticks. Come daylight, they was moving back into town, and that was from a looter of lopers. Governor Deneen arranged for the homeless to take refuge in the state arsenal and in tents at Camp Lincoln. Several hundred went to the arsenal. However, many refused to live there and wanted to leave the city as they felt unsafe. For God's sakes, Mr. Deneen, give me enough money to make myself and child to Missouri. These white folks have sent word to me that they will burn my house and murder me, and that was from an elderly black woman, August 17, 1908. Many refugees who fled were denied any assistance in neighboring towns and were turned away with no provisions, even after long treks. For example, Buffalo, about 15 miles from Springfield, posted a sign at the train station, "All niggers wanted out of town by Monday 12 a.m. sharp. Buffalo sharp shooters." Refugees who took trains to Jacksonville, Peoria, and Sterling were met by armed police who prevented them from getting off the train. When black people arrived in Greenridge and begged for food, they were stoned out of town. In Gage Park, white residents threatened over 40 black refugee families with shotguns, ropes, and lynching should they try to attempt to seek shelter there. Such rejection brought about more deaths. For example, Lawrence Payne fled Springfield with his wife and 3-week-old daughter. After the family was denied refuge from the elements in the white towns along the route of their march, the baby died of exposure. It is uncertain how many black people permanently left the city due to the attacks. Many newspapers claim that more than 2,000 fled, which might have been likely during the attack and its immediate aftermath. It appears that most black people did return to Springfield or were replaced by new migrants. Prior to the attack, Springfield had about 2,700 black people. 2 years later, per the 1910 census, the black population had risen to just under 3,000. Those who did return and found that they were rendered homeless sought refuge at the State Arsenal building, joining the 300 black people who had not left the arsenal since the attacks began. Some newspapers labeled the returnees as fugitives. At least 400 black people will live in the Arsenal building in the aftermath of the attacks, and some officials feared their very presence would incite a riot. To prevent such incitement, the militiamen kept the doors to the armory closed, brought the residents food and prepared by militia cooks, and discouraged them from leaving the building. The militia quelled the riot on August 15th, with nearly 50 homes and 35 businesses left in ruins. It was reported that violent explosions and winds could not have accomplished more destruction. The Negro quarters over these places were emptied and every window was shot out. Can't you give me a ticket to Bloomington? I've got a son up there and I'm sure he will give me a home. I can't see why they treat me as if I'm a dog. Here I is 76 years old next week. Me and my girl saved up $300 and put it all in a home. Now our home is done burned up and we're without a place to sleep, let alone enough to wear. And this is a quote. It says from a black woman who was a resident of the Badlands, August 22nd, 1908. Within 1 week, pictures of the burned ruins were sold as postcards and others as memorabilia. There was over $120,000 in property damage by fire and $35,000 filed in personal damages. Adjusted for inflation in 2018, total amount equates to about $4 million. However, not included in those estimates was property damage due to vandalism. With cost to transport and feed the state militia during the violence, the total cost to the state was $265,000 or about $7 million in 2018. The family of Scott Barton sued the city for $5,000, as did the family of William Donegan. The families of 4 other black people who were killed were denied the right to file suits, as the city attributed the cause of their deaths not to the attacks but to uncontrollable force majeure. As lawsuits began mounting up against the city, it refused to pay anything. The city shifted the blame for the attacks and failure to protect the citizens to the state. Springfield filed a lawsuit against the state claiming that the militia failed to stop the attacks as it lacked ammunition supplies, was forbidden from charging the mob, and that the damages that happened in Springfield occurred after the state took charge of the situation. The city ended up denying payment to all claimants seeking damages, with exception to the families of Burton and Donegan, citing Section 5 of the Illinois Criminal Code, suppression of mob violence. The surviving spouse, lineal heirs, or adopted children of any such other persons who, before the loss of life, were dependent for support upon any other person shall hereafter suffer death by lynching at the hands of a mob in any county or city of this state, may recover from such county or city damages for injuries sustained by reason for the loss of life of such person to a sum not exceeding $5,000. Ballard's wife and 2 minor daughters filed what was described by a local paper as one of the most peculiar suits ever filed at the time. Under the Dram Shop Act, they filed a $10,000 suit against Edward White and James Smith, the owners of Dandy Jim's Saloon, where Joe James had been drinking, and also against Jacob B. Oling, who owned the building where Dandy Jim's operated. As one of the first civil suits of its kind, the case was watched with great interest by the legal profession. The family alleged that the 3 men cited were liable for clergy Ballard's death because they served James alcohol. They said if the men had not served James alcohol, he would not have become a drunk and would not have allegedly killed Ballard. Newspapers were filled with reports of hostility and violence against black people. For example, the same day the Springfield riot began in Pensacola, Florida, large crowds were reported waiting outside the jailhouse with excitement to lynch a black man accused of assaulting a white woman. That same night, in Media, Pennsylvania, a black man committed suicide rather than let himself be captured by a mob hunting him for allegedly threatening a white woman. And at 1 a.m. on August 15th, a mob of 300 men showed up at the Norfolk, Virginia County Jail planning to lynch 2 black men accused of criminally assaulting a white woman. By December 1908, some 88 lynchings had been recorded that year across the country. Black people were 95% of the victims. Springfield, with its thriving vice district, also had a history of violence prior to the attacks. Immediately after Ballard's death, newspapers added his death to the long list of bloody murders which have stained the history of Springfield. For example, on the day James first appeared before the special grand jury, his case was one of the 2 murder cases brought to. The other case was one of whites killing a white, Ira Dudley and Michael Lynch, a white livery driver and a white miner, were both charged with the July 2nd murder of Marcus Neal when they allegedly hit him over the head with a club and fractured his skull. Such violence continued in the aftermath of the riot, further heightening tensions. On August 23rd, 1 week after the riot, Thomas Brady, a 70-year-old white man, was murdered in his sleep at his store on East Washington Street, where the riot had been intense. Although Grady's 26-year-old white employee Frank Bryant was guilty of the crime prior to his capture, rumors circulated that Grady had been murdered by a black man. The black population feared in becoming targets again of whites on no evidence. The riot violence spread beyond Springfield. Whites in surrounding states arbitrarily attacked black people in their homes. For example, on August 16th, a black man, George Mondy, was walking in Evansville, Indiana, when he passed 2 white men discussing the riot in Springfield. When the men saw Mondy, they attacked him and nearly stabbed him to death. The whites of Springfield largely came to support the riot and eventually showed sympathy for the attackers. Whites talked about how everybody knows that mob has made our families safe, boasting that the attacks were the best thing that ever happened to the capital city, and celebrating that this was only the beginning of a crusade that shall make Springfield decent and keep it that way. Springfield had no shame. She stood for the action of the mob. She hoped the rest of the Negroes might flee. She threatened that the movement to drive them out would continue. I do not speak of the leading citizens, but of the masses of people, of working men in the shops, the storekeepers in the stores, and the drivers, the men of the street, the wounded in the hospitals. And that was a quote from William English Walling on September 3rd, 1908. 2 weeks after Ballard died, the Illinois State Journal began running a comic strip, Sambo and His Funny Voices. The comic relegated black people to bumbling stereotypes, allowing whites to ridicule and diminish black citizens. Black people were harassed and assaulted for several weeks after the affair. The Springfield community had primarily blamed black people for the violence, or blamed both sides. The colored people are themselves partly to blame for rioting themselves, although the blame and rebellion, all these is shared by the whites. And that was a quote from Reverend E.E. Frame from the Plymouth Congregational Church. Sin is at the bottom of it all. This murder of Ballard and assault of last Thursday are simply outcroppings of an evil nature. And that was from the Reverend Billy Sunday. The implication is clear that the conditions, not the populace, were to blame, and that many good citizens could find no other remedy than that applied by the mob. It was not the fact of the whites' hatred toward the Negroes, but of the Negroes' own misconduct, general inferiority, and unfitness for free institutions that were at fault. And that was a quote from the Illinois State Journal. Such sympathy factored into the narrative of the attacks, minimizing the role of whites. For example, following the attacks, newspapers began erroneously reporting that white deaths had outnumbered the deaths of black people. The only deaths of black people reported were the deaths of prominent men of Springfield, such as Burton and Donegan. This false claim, which suggested that black people had killed the whites who died and that the attacks were mutual in nature, was reported as fact for over 100 years. Following the attacks, Mayor Reese nullified without explanation the saloon licenses of 6 of Springfield's black-owned saloons, forcing their owners and employees to find new sources of income. This also meant that black people were abruptly deprived of casual neighborhood gathering places. Lee F. Osborne, a black saloon owner, could not acquire a license for 4 months. The city approved it only after he obtained the backing of a black law and order league led by a pastor and promised to run a model saloon. Black municipal workers, recognized as faithful, honest men of long service, lost their jobs. Mayor Reese laid off all black firemen for the good of the service and all black policemen who he said would no longer be useful in their jobs. Reese thought that getting rid of black workers would avoid trouble with whites and reduce post-riot tensions. In addition, Mayor Reese received black hand letters telling him to fire them or face more violence. Black laborers were also threatened with job loss. For example, 3 coal mines, including Woodside and Tucson, employed approximately 500 men, of which 30% were black. Following the attacks, the 350 white miners went to the president of the Springfield United Mine Workers Union, refusing to work with black miners, stating that they felt unsafe working with black people underground. The mine shut down for several days, only reopening when mine executives threatened to bring in black strike breakers if the white miners did not resume work. Several others white employers also received letters in the mail threatening their lives and property if they did not dismiss their black employees or if they did business with black people. Because merchants refused to deliver provisions to black people at Camp Lincoln, hesitated to serve black people in town, or overcharged them when they did, the state purchased $10,000 worth of groceries to resell to black people so they could have food. White men immediately galvanized around the notion of restricting black people from voting. From 1890 to 1908, legislatures of southern states had passed new constitutions and laws that raised barriers to voter registration, effectively disenfranchising most black people and excluding them from politics. This policy was enforced for decades into the late 1960s. The male citizen of the black belt in late years has come to pose as a political factor in Springfield. Do you want niggers to make white man's laws? If not, get busy. Have all the men who have made our laws for the past 30 years been elected by the intelligent white vote or by the majority of an ignorant, vicious Negro vote? And that is a quote from the Springfield News, August 17, 1908. Directed to arrest all suspicious characters, police quickly began arresting black people known to have lost their jobs or homes in the riot for vagrancy. In some cases, police conducted raids to their homes to do so. If unable to pay a $100 fine, the black people were given hours to leave town. Most of those arrested lived or had businesses in the politically influential Levee District. For example, 7 such arrests were made in one day, 1 week after the rioting. The following week, police raided the homes of 9 more black people, arrested them for vagrancy, and presented them with the same ultimatum to leave. 6 months later, the city held a centennial celebration in honor of Lincoln's birthday. It was a black tie event held at the State Arsenal building featuring prominent American and foreign dignitaries. It was held at the same place used to shelter 300 black people during the riots. More than 700 whites attended the $25 per plate event. No African American was invited, although many black people wanted to celebrate Lincoln and his emancipation of slaves. Edward H. Morris, a prominent Chicago black lawyer, did purchase a ticket to the event. When organizers learned that he was black, his ticket was rescinded. It was reported that black people were thoroughly over the fact that they are deprived in the big doings around Springfield, and it stipulated that from this point out, the social order of the city had changed. The colored population hereabouts will be represented only by the gents who slipped the soup to the white guests. By August 17th, over 200 people had been arrested in connection with the attacks. The state attorney general Frank L. Hatch said that he had evidence to charge at least 15 people with murder. Hatch filed a motion for a special jury. On the morning of August 17th, because the jails were overflowing, Judge James A. Creighton granted the special jury to move the process along. Creighton asked Sheriff Warner how quickly he could get 23 men together. Warner responded that he could corral men by 2 p.m. that afternoon. Creighton set the jury investigations to begin at that time and ordered that the investigations be conducted in secret. At 2 p.m., Warner returned to the courthouse with the same 23 men who constituted the special grand jury that indicted Joe James 4 weeks prior. By early September, the grand jury seeking to place blame for the deaths and the destruction of property brought 117 indictments against dozens of individuals. In late October, the grand jury brought an additional 32 indictments against mob participants for malicious mischief, bringing the total of indictments to 149. 4 of the indictments were against police officers Oscar Dahlkamp, Joseph Farames, George Pullman, and George W. Dawson for grossly neglecting any efforts to suppress the riots. The special grand jury said this of the police: "After the most diligent inquiry, we condemn in unmeasured terms the cowardly, contemptuous actions of those members of the police force who have taken the oath of office failed to do their duty. Men who are paid from money obtained from the pockets of the people of the city to protect life and property, men who were ordered by the heads of the department of the police to go out and disperse the mob, who not only failed to use as a club, handle a pistol, or raise a voice against the mob on the side of the law and order, but some who are showed to have assisted by act and word in doing so, that has brought the blush shame to every law-abiding citizen of this city." Approximately 10% of the indictments were against black men who were charged with crimes such as assault with a deadly weapon, assault to intent murder, or robbery. Most white men were charged with lesser charges of mischief, riot, or larceny. For example, Andrew J. Gordon, a black former St. Louis detective who then resided in Springfield and who local whites referred to as Big Nigger Gordon, was indicted for the attempted murder and robbery of William H. Bowe. Gordon denied the charges. Former Detective Gordon ended up working as a janitor the following year, according to the city directory. Most of the black men arrested for Bowe's shooting were known to be politically influential among colored voters. They were held in jail on bench warrants from August 14th until November 3rd, past voter registration day in the city. Because they were in jail, they were prevented from registering, but on November 2nd, some of the black men were released if they could post a $1,000 bond, with the understanding that they were to boost for Fred Mortimer, who was running for the most important county office, state attorney, in an election taking place the following day. Kate Howard, who had incited the violence on Loper's property in the lynchings of Burton and Donegan, was the first attacker to be indicted. A charge was brought against her for the murder of Burton. Nicknamed Springfield Joan in homage to Joan of Arc, Howard was seen throwing bricks at and stealing a substantial amount of silverware and linen from Loper's restaurant, which she looted for her hotel. It was reported at Burton's lynching she behaved like a fury of the French Revolution. In an interview, Howard said her actions were inspired by observations during a trip she'd taken to the South with her brother. While in Texas and Arkansas, she saw how stringently whites enforced segregation, which their legislatures had passed into law, and thought it worked to teach the Negro where he belonged. When she returned to Springfield, she noticed more businesses boycotting black people, but thought they were being cowardly in enforcing it. She thought it was time for the city's whites to act up and take action that she was willing to steer. After the attack, she proudly displayed buckshot wounds in her arms, which were rumored to have been inflicted during Burton's lynching. She said that she believed white citizens would not allow her to be punished. But when arrested and facing 10 indictments, Howard said that she was not guilty. She said she had gone into Loper's only to collect souvenirs of the attack. One of the souvenirs was a 20-pound bucket of lard. After Howard was indicted, a white saloon keeper posted her a $10,000 bond. When Deputy Sheriff Kramer arrived at her home to arrest her on the murder charge, she excused herself to change her clothes. When she stepped away, she secretly swallowed arsenic, then allowed Deputy Kramer to place her under arrest, telling him, "I'm ready to go." By the time she reached the jail, Howard collapsed and died as she walked through the door. Prior to the trial, Assistant State Attorney William St. John Wines expressed confidence in securing convictions against both defendants, stating, "I have known lots of guilty men to go free, but I have never known an innocent man to be convicted." When Richardson was in jail, expert doctors examined him and concluded that he had no connection with her as in Mabel Hallam in any way. This was concluded as Mabel Hallam was afflicted with a sexually transmitted infection born from her alleged rape, of which Richardson was not affected. Shortly before this revelation, Rolla Keyes, the witness that Hallam procured to support her accusation against Richardson, was accidentally shot by 14-year-old Harold McLaughlin when a revolver he was playing with accidentally discharged while he, Keyes, and 16-year-old Albert Chester Brown were out fishing. Keyes was white, along with Harold and Chester, who lived on North 5th Street and North 4th Street respectively. Because he was a key grand jury witness for Hallam, his shooting upset many whites as rumors spread that he was shot by a black man as vengeance for testifying against Richardson. There was a fear that whites would again attack black people, with some proclaiming it's time to get after those niggers again. We'll have to go out and hang some more of them. However, the boys helped quell the pending attacks by providing more details about the accident and stipulating their fear of reporting it, as they too thought it could lead to rumors that could incite more white violence. Following the shooting, no further news stories on Rolla were produced. After Hallam was made aware of Richardson's medical examinations 2 weeks after Richardson had been indicted, she recanted her accusation about him, and on September 1st then accused Ralph Burton, who she alleged to be the 19-year-old son of the lynch, Scott Burton. Hallam stated she was certain young Burton, who was rumored to be in Wichita, was her attacker. The Negro who assaulted me was shorter and stouter than my husband, who was 5 feet 6 inches and weighs about 135 pounds. I could not tell whether the fellow was light or dark skinned, so frightened I was by what was happening. I positively know Richardson did not commit the crime, and I'm not backward in acknowledging the mistake, but if the right Negro is brought before me, I will be able to identify him beyond a doubt in a short time. However, Scott Burton's son Charles and wife Kate told authorities that Burton had no such son. With Hallam no longer pressing charges, George Richardson was released from jail without incident. He received no restitution or apology for his time away from work or harm to his name. He went on to work as a janitor and lived until he was 76 when he died at St. John's Hospital. His obituary did not mention any of the events of 1908. Hallam would again recant her accusation, this time of Burton's alleged son, later admitting that she lied in order to cover up an assault suffered at the hands of her husband after he found out about an affair she was having with another white man when she began exhibiting symptoms of her STI. To provide an explanation of her battered face, she concocted the story that she was raped by a black man. No charges were filed against her for perjury or for making a false report. Hallam and her husband moved to Chicago shortly after the events. She died in 1921, purportedly of suicide at the age of 34. Shortly after Richardson was released, Joe James, who within 2 days of Ballard's death had been labeled as the Negro who killed Clergy Ballard, was brought to trial. Many black people in the city feared being attacked again if James was acquitted, packing their personal effects so they could leave town the moment the jury read its verdict. Judge Creighton also ordered a special veneer of 100 jurors to be on hand. A total of 123 potential jurors were excused before the final jury was compiled. The defense barred men born in the South from serving on the jury. The defense also asked potential jurors to reveal where they were during the riotous acts and if they harbored any prejudice toward black people. During his incarceration, he repeatedly refused to enter a guilty plea of murder. He initially entered a plea of not guilty, but his lawyers changed the plea right before the trial began and entered one of self-defense. James was represented pro bono by black attorneys Octavius V. Royal and A. Morris Williams. Royal requested a change of venue, noting his belief that James could not receive a fair trial in the county. However, Judge James A. Creighton denied the request. In no county in the state does so little prejudice exist against the colored race as in the county of Sangamon. As the trial began, several black hand letters were sent to Sheriff Werner and left in the yard of the courthouse, threatening more violence if James was not hanged. The letters included demands such as, if Joe James don't hang, we are going to kill him and run every nigger out of town. An effigy of James was also hanged from a telephone pole at 3rd and Washington Streets with the message, "Nigger, don't let the sun go down on you." The police excused the effigy as a quote-unquote bit of humor. A week prior to James's hanging, his mother, Catherine Katie Roberts, wrote a letter to Sheriff Warner that she wanted to be there for her son's hanging but was too poor to make the trip. However, by the day before James' hanging, Katie was able to visit James before his death, as numerous black women in her community donated money to her so that she could travel to see James before he died. Roberts was able to see her son twice when she arrived. During her first visit, James reportedly never once looked into his mother's face while she gazed with tear-dimmed eyes into his. Reportedly, the mother and son said few words, with James occasionally muttering "mother." During her last visit, he also reportedly told her that he was innocent of the crime but not innocent of sin. They then gave each other a long hug, and she stared at him for about 3 minutes before leaving. She reportedly half muttered goodbye on her way out. James, described as a Negro boy scarcely of legal age and who had no money to appeal his sentence, was hanged in the Sangamon County Jail on October 23rd, 1908 at 10:30 a.m. He was hanged on the city's old gallows, unused since 1898 but refurbished specifically for his death. Nearly 150 spectators witnessed the hanging, including 8 sheriffs from nearby counties who were invited as guests of Sheriff Werner. Only 2 black people were present for James' hanging, James's lawyer and his spiritual advisor. Before he was hanged, Sheriff Warner asked if he had anything to say. He responded, "No, sir." 2 minutes later, Sheriff's Deputy Fred Long sprung the trap. It took 11 minutes for James to die. When his body was taken down, the noose was so tight around his neck that it could not be loosened by hand and had to be cut. Thousands waited in line to view the gallows, with many asking for a piece of the hemp from the rope that hanged James as a souvenir. Later, 7,000 people waited in line outside the undertaker shop McCabe and Guy to see his body on display. The next day, his mother claimed his body and took it on a train back to Birmingham. Although it was stated by his spiritual advisors, Reverend Doswell, a black minister, and Reverend Brent of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, who accompanied him to the scaffold of the morning he was hanged, that James maintained to the end that he had nothing to confess, that he knew nothing of what occurred on the night of the crime. He provided a statement right before he was hanged that was taken as a confession. It had been provided at the urging of a white religious inmate volunteer, Mary Hickey, who pressured the young man to confess to his soul would not be damned. He allegedly wrote the following: "I am sorry for the crime I had committed. Drunkenness was the cause of it, in that I have grossly sinned against Mr. Ballard, his family, and each and every citizen. But I ask for each and every one's forgiveness. When the deed was committed, I was a sinner and a man of the world. Since then, I have become a Christian and am confident that God has forgiven me my sins. To each and every one, I, Joe James, wish to say, whiskey and the evil effects of it are the cause of my being where I am today. I did not realize the greatness of my crime until I was brought to the city prison the next morning after I committed it." That was written by Joe James on October 23rd, 1908. I don't know why I keep saying 2000. Perhaps James was drunk when he killed my father, but it's hard for me to believe. I ran him to North Grand Avenue and was unable to overtake the fleeing Negro. James was able to run, and if he was as drunk as they claim, it does not appear to me that he would be able to make such fast time. The day after he was hanged, the Illinois State Journal commented on the importance of James to Springfield. "Springfield will not soon forget Joe James. The youthful Alabama Negro has played too important a role on the stage of life in the city to have his name quickly erased from the tablets." Whites who had political and economic power could escape the torment of living around those different from themselves, maintaining a social perception of white supremacy. However, those who lacked the economic and political power were tormented by the reality that they were not superior to the black people and immigrants they lived among at all. This created a perception that they were under siege and felt compelled to take action to assert and maintain their dominance in the social arena and punish those who they deemed to have transgressed against them. The levy had been allowed to exist because of political conditions. No candidate for office have dared to overlook this Negro vote. It was knowledge of this political power and their long immunity which has made the Negro unbearable in Springfield. It was this that drove the mob to destroy the entire district. The reign of the Negro has ended. That was posted by the Chicago Tribune on August 18th, 1908. Poor immigrants, on the other hand, looking for acceptance as Americans, aligned themselves with the dominant social class through skin color, which in America superseded nationality, culture, and religion. Black people were easy targets because they were few in number, had no means to fight back, and as an unprotected class of citizens could be harmed with minimal, if any, repercussions. Ultimately, Springfield's whites attacked the cities of black people simply because they could. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes this episode of the Black Massacre series, episode 15, the Springfield Riot or Massacre of 1908. If you haven't done so already, you can go back and recap on whatever episodes that you missed out on, or just get a refresher by clicking on the Black Massacre series playlist. Stay tuned, as next week we will be going into episode 16 of the Black Massacre series. Stay safe and be one.